everyone. This is Alex with the Free American Press. Today, we welcome back a very special guest, Mr. Joseph P. Farrell, who is an Oxford educated historian who specializes in alternative history, World War II, and special technologies. Hello, Joseph. Thank you for being back on the show. If you enjoy our content and want to keep seeing amazing guests and insightful conversations, please like this video, share it with friends, and subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to support the channel directly, you can contribute through Zelle or Venmo. Every little bit helps me continue bringing you interesting guests and great content. Thank you so much for your support.
Hey, Alex, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, so my first question happens from what just recently happened. We saw the UK just mandate a digital ID. So I want
Yes.
to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I've been railing against this rollout of what I can only characterize along with Catherine Fitz, who actually made the observation, I think, first in terms of people in the alternative media tracking all of this rollout of mass surveillance, digital ID, cryptocurrency, so-called central bank digital currency, and everything else. What she has argued, and I think quite persuasively, and I happen to agree with it, is they're rolling out essentially a beast system. I mean, beast in terms of the book of Revelation, because what a digital ID is, it's a step on the way to tracking your every move, your every purchase. A central bank digital currency is very much the same thing. It's another step toward a social credit system. You know, be good little boys and girls and do what we say and think what we tell you to think. Otherwise, we're going to turn off your money.
Right.
So, this couple that with the build out of this mass surveillance system by people like Peter Thiel, and he's come right out very baldly and nakedly holding these seminars on the Antichrist in San Francisco for technocrats. So it's fairly clear what their intention is. I look at the UK, and the other part of this we've got to remember, in the UK particularly, we're also dealing with the phenomenon of mass immigration from more or less predominantly Muslim countries. And I don't care what anyone tells me, call me a curmudgeon. I don't care. Islam is simply not compatible with Western civilization, period. End of discussion. It simply isn't. So we've been watching essentially a quiet, slow takeover of the United Kingdom. And the digital ID is, I think, just another step along the way. It's typical problem reaction solution type of Hegelian dialectic, because what they're doing is, okay, they're creating a cultural crisis, meaning too many mass immigrants from countries that share no common values with the United Kingdom. And then in order to solve that, we need to track everybody. So let's roll out the digital ID. So, these people running the West right now are quite frankly just insane. The other problem, the other problem I want to mention in this respect is that along with digital ID and cryptocurrency, and I prefer that people call cryptocurrencies what they really are. They're kleptocurrencies. They are a massive scam, because what's also happening, and you can look at people like Larry Fink at BlackRock and so on, uh, President Trump's quote unquote sovereign wealth fund. All of these things are, in my opinion, schemes to tokenize the assets of the country. And this is a very important thing I hope people latch on to. In the old Soviet Union, there was a kind of private property, and this is what people don't get about the Soviet communist system, because the entire assets of the country were more or less claimed to be held by the people of the country. So, in other words, when you spent a ruble at the store or wherever you were spending your ruble, that ruble represented a token on a part or a fraction of the total assets of the country. So, in that sense, the assets of the Soviet Union were tokenized. And in that sense, they could claim to be backing their currency and making the currency sound. Follow me?
Yeah.
Now, what you see going on with President Trump's sovereign wealth fund, people like Larry Fink at BlackRock and so on. Well, Larry Fink has come right out and said, well, the next thing that we're going to do is tokenize the assets. So look what they're doing, Alex. What they're doing is they're giving you electronic blips and they're taking the hard assets of the country in return.
It's
And
crazy.
yeah, well, it's not just crazy, it's diabolical is what it is. It's another, this is a pump and dump scheme to end all pump and dump schemes. So, I'm not in favor of any of this digital IDs, digital currency, tokenized assets. No, 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 no.
Yeah. Yeah, neither am I. I definitely think these digital ID is crazy. And I'm glad you told us some more about the beast system and how cryptocurrency is involved in that. And so I just want to get your thoughts. So we see digital ID being implemented in the UK right now. When do you think it'll be implemented in America? When do you think we'll see America have the beast system?
Well, if people don't wake up, uh, I would say within the next 5 to 10 years.
Mm,
We're already seeing little glimpses of how this system is going to quote unquote work. I mean, just look at what the Democrats have done during this shutdown. What they're essentially doing is they're telling, people on food stamps or whatever, you don't get your benefits because we don't get our way as the minority with what the Trump administration is doing. So we're going to hold all of you hostage and you put the pressure on them and you do what we tell you to and go out and protest and all of that. Otherwise, you're not going to get your benefits. So in other words, you're getting a glimpse right now of what they're capable of doing. If you think it's bad now, just wait until all money is in a digital form, blips on a computer screen, and then they decide to turn it off.
right.
If I go back to the fundamental principle of private property, privacy, and money. You have to have a physical medium of exchange. In other words, there has to be either a coin or a piece of paper or something that protects your anonymity and your privacy in transaction. Because without that, you don't really have an economic system. You have a system of total control. And, that's the beast system. So I give it 5 to 10 years. However, it can all, and again, I'm four square with Catherine Fitz here. I have started, Alex, in the last few years using cash for virtually every transaction that I conduct. About the only time anymore that I use my debit card, I just bought some Christmas presents today. And that's about the only time I will use my debit card is if I need to order something that's coming from a long distance away.
Yeah.
Otherwise, around town, I use cash for gas, I use cash for groceries, and I'm standing in line and I'm seeing all these people with their telephones, playing around like this and not talking to each other. And then they're using the automated checkout stand where they're scanning their own stuff and then they're putting in the little plastic card. And I'm like, people, wake up.
You're
You're
so right. Yeah, you're so right about that because it seems that's why I really think it's great that you only sell your books in the physical format and not digital because
Yeah.
I think they're trying to get rid of the physical world and turn it to digital so they can track and trace everything you do.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's bad enough now that they're doing this, and now they're rolling out these artificial intelligence data centers, which is going to be another, it's already proving to be another kind of a bubble of its own. But it's going to be another disaster. I mean, the people running all of this are just absolutely nuts. They are stupid and they're crazy. I go back to that talk we did a while back about the incompetence of evil.
Yeah.
They're just nuts.
I definitely agree with you. It's nuts that any person would want to make digital slavery outdoor prison for people.
Yeah.
It's really nuts. And you mentioned the government shutdown, and I have made a few videos lately about that. It
Hmm.
seems to me like it's been planned. This is something they've been planning for a while.
Sure.
Do you think this will go on for quite a while longer, or do you think we're seeing the last vestiges of it?
No, I think I'm with those people that think that the Democrats are waiting for the midterm election results, and then after that, it's going to collapse fairly quickly. The problem with this shutdown, at least in my opinion, as far as I can tell, is that it's very different from previous shutdowns. The 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 narrative is not helping the Democrats. Everybody knows they're the ones holding it up, and that's not helping their positioning in the polls, and it's only going to make matters worse for them long term. That said, I've been around. I'm old enough to remember President Eisenhower's leaving office speech, the famous military. And I was about 3.5 years old. But I remember him interrupting my favorite television program. Who's this old bald guy that's, wasting my time and keeping me from my. So I remember that speech. And I have watched the Republicans all of my life pledge to do this and that and shrink the size of government and rein in spending and blah blah blah, and they get into office and they get into power and they do absolutely nothing, and they lose their nerve and they lose their spine.
Yeah.
So the other part of me is just waiting, for this Republican resistance to collapse. I don't know if it's going to or not, but the track record is not very good. And if they, on this one, if they cave into the Democrats on this one, you can pretty much kiss everything goodbye, because you're going to end up with more and more demands for more and more money to fix healthcare. And, I was there for the first fix when Lyndon Johnson signed the Medicare Medicaid bill into law, and healthcare prices started to skyrocket almost immediately.
Yeah.
So, as far as I'm concerned, that's another big no-no. Get the government out of healthcare, but to them it's control. It's a method of control of the population. So I expect it's going to collapse after the midterms tomorrow. Um, I'd give it at best 2 weeks. I don't think that any protests or there are already people talking about looting the grocery stores. Well, we're just going to go in and steal our food.
Yeah.
Um, we saw how that riot response worked out for the Democrats in the last election. I don't think it's going to help them at all. Plus, New York City is about ready to elect an Islamunist, as I like to call him.
Yeah.
So, as the mayor of that city. So, that party's just completely gone off the rails, and it's taking the Republicans close behind, right with them.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. So I think you came up with some pretty good suggestions about stopping the beast system, like using cash,
Yep.
not using the self-checkout. Is there
Yep.
any other ideas or thoughts that you have on how we can stop the beast system? Because 5 or 10 years is just,
Well, the thing that you have to do, and Catherine Fitz has actually talked about this on her website. She publishes little booklets with every quarterly wrap up she does, and she published a booklet with the last wrap up where she talks about some of the things you can do. And one of the things that I think that she talks about that we need to latch on to very quickly is your state legislature needs to pass legal tender bills for money. In other words, and what I mean by that is your state legislature needs to make it absolutely clear that businesses must accept American currency in transaction. They should not be allowed to be in business on a debit card only basis. So you should be able to go into any store and lay a $5 bill down and buy some bubble gum. It's that simple and get change for it. That's the first step. Your states need to step up and create money resolutions that are a matter of state law. Now, I say that with some caution because a lot of Americans are being, I think, snookered by states passing these state bullion depository or state suspension of sales tax on gold and silver and making gold and silver, recognizing gold and silver as legal tender. And the reason I think that this is a very bad idea, let me show you something.
Okay.
This is the other part of the tokenized asset. See that?
Oh, yes.
That's an Oklahoma goldback.
Yeah.
Okay. This is a sheet of laminated plastic with a thin micro layer of actual 24 karat gold. That's what gives it its gold color. So this now is supposedly gold backed currency, okay, that I can take to certain businesses and spend.
Yeah.
But what it says down here at the bottom, which you can't see, there's a little inscription. If you look right close,
Oh,
right,
yeah. I see that. Yeah.
it says 1/2000th of a troy ounce 24 karat gold. That's the amount of gold in this sheet of plastic. 1/2000th of an ounce.
Wow.
So, in other words, they're claiming to be on a gold standard, but look what they're doing. They're tokenizing another asset with this. So, in other words, avoid all of these people saying that they're taking the money to a gold standard because I can't go into a bank and ask for 1/2000th of a bit of gold. It's a bit different, back in the days that we were on a gold standard. You take your dollar bill into the bank and you get a gold dollar or a silver dollar in return for your dollar bill. So, in other words, the fractionalization of that particular asset is made possible by what? It's made possible by computers and computing.
Right.
So, in other words, to make this system work, you have to have a massive digital clearing system based on computers, and you're right back to square one.
Yeah.
They're giving you a digital currency and saying, well, this is gold backed. you know,
Right. That's really a scary thing for me is a digital currency,
yeah,
but they say it's going to be backed by gold, and it's you can't get the gold, so it's
right,
backed by nothing. It's just a
right,
scam. Uh,
right.
Yeah, I did have a guest on my show. His name is Patrick Holland, and he's with the Missouri Freedom Initiative. And he
Hmm.
actually wrote the bill to make the Missouri Constitutional Money Act.
Hmm.
So the bill basically stops taxes for gold and silver, and also allows for people to use gold and silver at their clerks and like buy things with gold and silver. So I guess if that's, do you think that's a good solution if we can keep it from
Well,
the system?
it depends on how you're implementing it.
Yeah.
It's more than just saying that we recognize gold and silver in transaction. Because, let's say I have a 1 ounce silver coin, okay? And it's stamped on that coin $1, okay? Now I can go in to any business and use that silver dollar to make a purchase. The question is, how is the business that I'm transacting with, how are they valuing that dollar? Are they accepting the stamped value, or are they accepting the actual bullion value of 1 ounce of silver, which is right now is around $50?
Right.
Okay. So in other words, if you're going to transact in bullion, let's say that this worthless piece of plastic with a thin little sheet of gold on it, let's say that this was an actual $1 gold certificate. Okay.
Yeah.
I go in and spend it, and or I take it to my bank and I get a gold dollar, which you could use to do. And then I take the gold dollar and spend it. Well, how are they evaluating the dollar? Is it because it's stamped $1? Are they going to evaluate? If I were to spend that, I'd be stupid,
Right.
because that 1 ounce of gold is worth right now about, $4,500 in paper money. So I'd be
Yeah.
stupid. So it all depends on how you're doing it. If your local business is set up and valuating whatever bullion you're spending in transaction at the market price of the bullion that day, then yeah, I'd say it's a good idea. But if you're valuing it on the basis of the minted value, then you're losing money.
Yeah, that
So
makes sense. Yeah. Because you don't want to bring a $4,000 worth gold coin and just get $50 with stamp from it.
bingo, bingo. I want that's why people have bullion, is because it's a store of value. So again, I think people have to be very, very cautious. And let's look at the other aspect of this is legal history. If you look at when you say constitutional money, what are we talking about? Because if you go back to the time of the Constitution, when the framers said that Congress has the power to make and coin money and regulate the value thereof, what they were talking about is the value relationship between gold and silver, which at that time was about 16 ounces of silver were equivalent to 1 ounce of gold.
Yeah.
And the dollar itself is coming from the Spanish dollar at that day, which was a piece of eight. Okay. The old pieces of eight. So historically, that's constitutional money. So when we say restoring constitutional money, are we restoring the gold to silver ratio? Are we recognizing, this is the problem after the American Civil War? Are we recognizing silver as money?
Right.
Because the United States, after the Civil War, went into the deflationary spiral because it no longer recognized silver as money. Then on and on we could go. I mean, this is my point. We've been here before. We
Right.
have been here before. And the real question is, are we once again going to let the banksters plunder everybody blind in the name of a fiscal policy that they're saying is going to make everybody happy? Well, I've listened to their lies long enough. So
Yeah.
I urge people, yeah, back constitutional money and use cash, but be very sure that when you are backing that you're backing the genuine article and not a bill of goods.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah. Because yeah, it makes complete sense to me. So do you think doing that, if they back the actual article of goods, do you think that's a good way to get out of the beast system?
Yes, but here's the problem.
Okay.
And it's exemplified by this. Okay. And I've been saying this, Alex, for years,
Yeah.
you know, uh, and it's always been in response to people that say, well, we need to move back to a gold standard or a gold and silver standard, or we need to have backing for our money. Okay. And this is what so-called tokenization is all about. It's another form of backing, only in tokenization, you're backing in quotation marks the currency with the sum total of all hard assets in a country. That's what tokenization is.
Yeah.
But the problem, if you're dealing more narrowly with bullion backing, is you cannot back the amount of money in circulation now at par value with bullion. There's not enough there's not enough gold in the world, or if you're on a bimetallic standard, there's not enough gold and silver in the world to do that.
Right.
So you either revalue the currency, you devalue it. This is what happened after the war between the states in this country, or you fractionalize it in this ridiculous way to say that all the circulating currency out there is backed. And
Yeah.
the other problem that people don't remember is we've got several different types of currency in circulation. You know, we've got paper money, we've got coin, which is a fraction of the actual money in circulation. Most of the money in circulation right now is in digital form of one form or another.
Right.
You know, and add to that bills of exchange, letters of credit, and so on and so forth. And you've got all sorts of types of money in circulation. So, you know, my second problem, therefore, is beware anyone that tells you that they have the master plan and solution to it all, because the system is too complex for anyone to have the solution. And by anyone, I mean Carstens at the Bank of International Settlements and Powell at the Federal Reserve and, you know, whoever's in charge of the Bank of England these days.
Yeah.
None of them, as far as I'm concerned, know what they're talking about. The system is too complex
Yeah.
for anyone to figure out and resolve.
So do you think it's impossible to save the system?
Um, if by the system you mean the financial system,
Yes.
I think it's possible to save it, but it's going to require a fundamental spiritual shift in the people running it. And I just don't see them as having the necessary moral equipment to do it. Um, they're in it for themselves. They've been running a plunder operation for centuries with, you know, with this central banking model. And it's, you know, it's, so to speak, it's in their blood. So I'm not optimistic that it can be saved in that sense, but I am optimistic that you're watching people wake up at a very quick rate. We saw the wake up begin politically in the previous three election cycles. Um, I think you're going to see, or possibly could see, a similarly strong reaction to the financial system on the part of people. And if that happens, and I think there are signs and indicators that it already is. After all, we just got done talking about your friend in Missouri with his Constitutional Money Act. Now, I may have all sorts of cautions and caveats about a lot of these acts, but one thing that I think is encouraging is that there are many people in many states that are proposing these measures, and that tells me that they're waking up, that there's a massive problem in the financial system.
Right.
So I think that's very positive news because people are now looking and scrutinizing every financial solution that's coming out of government, particularly central government. And more, I'm seeing more and more people react to the idea of digital currencies bad. We don't want it, which I think is really behind most of these state resolutions about money. Um, I just caution people that again, Mr. Central Banker has been in this game for many, many centuries, and they know how the game is played, and they are very adept at reading changes in the cultural orientation of a population, and they are usually able to get out ahead of it
Yeah.
and head it off. So that my cautions are only designed to keep people in mind that we're dealing with some very sophisticated players and they've been down this road before. So just exercise due caution. But I don't think I really don't think it's possible to roll it back on the part of Mr. Globaloney. And
Yeah.
there's one massive reason why it's going to be impossible, and that's Russia. because, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they tried this plunder operation on Russia. And what they got in return, they were successful for a while, and then bang, out went Yeltsin, and in came Putin, and he put a stop to it.
Yeah.
So the plunder operation that they were trying in Russia, which, they're still trying by hook or by crook to break up Russia and seize the assets and resources of Russia. That's what this so-called war, is all about over there. They're literally trying to break that country up again. So, the Russians have been through it many, many times. Um, you're seeing pushback against the Western financial system also big time with the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, China, India, and South Africa, because they're tired of playing the game. So we'll see where it goes. We'll see where it goes.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of big fighting in Ukraine still. And
Yes.
we talked about it a few years ago, and it seems like this war is a never-ending war, like it's never going to end. Do you think there's any chance of it ending soon, or do you think we're just going to continue seeing the war go on and on?
Well, I think the war will end in the sense that it will simply peter out.
Yeah,
I mean, when you study the war between the states in this country very closely, not the version you learn in school, but when you study it really closely, it just sort of sputters out. It seizes up and the engine can't turn anymore, and it just kind of stops. Um, it I think is going to happen the same way with this war with Russia and the Ukraine. It's just going to peter out. For one thing, the Ukraine is running out of resources and assets. To fight wars, you need manpower. That's just the basic bottom line.
yeah,
And Russia has a lot more than the Ukraine does. And it has a much larger industrial base by far than the Ukraine. I mean, uh, we're learning the hard way that Russia can produce munitions until they're blue in the face, and we can't keep up. Not even in this country, we can't keep up because we've outsourced all of our heavy industry.
yeah,
So, we can't even produce war material on anywhere close to the scale that we produced during World War II. Nowhere even close to that. So we're in a war of attrition and material that I don't think that the West can win. I don't think the West has the financial resources to pump out war material like it used to be able to. That's problem number one. And the Ukraine itself is running out of manpower. And now we're hearing stories that people, men of combat age in the Ukraine, are simply refusing to show up and be slaughtered, and who can blame them?
yeah,
So, I think it's just going to sputter to a halt. What that means, practically speaking, I don't know because Russia, I'm one of the odd people out of I have not been buying the narrative that the government in this country or the governments in Europe have been putting out. I have never bought the idea that Mr. Putin wants to re-expand Russia to the borders of the old Soviet Union. And I've never bought that idea for a very simple reason. The Russians found out the hard way that they couldn't afford to run that empire. So, I think the last thing on Putin's mind was when he started this military operation. I think the last thing on his mind was, I want to conquer and occupy the Ukraine. It's too expensive. Russia can't afford to do so. The Ukrainians don't want them to do so. So, it's a replay of setting up the old Soviet Union again because you're setting yourself up for another collapse. So I don't think he wants to do that. The problem is, what do you do with a country whose infrastructure is being shattered piece by piece? by a stupid military action that we, this country, talked them into, and then didn't supply the support to them that they needed to prosecute the war. Um, what's Russia going to do? Are they going to allow the vacuum to exist? Is the West going to allow the vacuum to exist? Probably not, but can it afford to help rebuild the Ukraine? Well, who knows? That remains to be seen. We're all, our financial system is already creaking and groaning, and now we're going to rebuild a major section of Europe again.
Yeah,
Uh, no.
it's definitely pretty crazy. I don't know. To me, it just seems like such a farce. It almost seems like this Ukrainian-Russian war was planned a long time ago.
Of course it was.
Because then the Soviet Union broke up, and then Russia was able to get Ukraine's nuclear bombs, which Ukraine supposedly had nuclear weapons. And now we're seeing that they're fighting now for control of territory that used to belong to Russia. It just seems like this was like planned a long time ago, and it's like doesn't make much sense that they're
Well,
fighting.
it was planned. You need look no further than the former Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, and her remarks that the whole purpose of the Minsk agreements with Russia was so that to give the Ukraine more time to build up its military. I mean, she came right out and admitted that. So,
Yeah.
in other words, that's an admission by a major Western leader and a major Western economic power. And at that time, Germany had not gutted its military like they have now. So they had a fairly decent military at the time. So the that is an admission that the West was planning the war
Yeah.
from straight out of the German chancellor's mouth. Now, put this into historical context. Have you ever studied the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk?
No.
All right. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was the treaty that was signed between the new Soviet Union and Imperial Germany and Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire that ended World War I on the Eastern Front when Russia surrendered to the Germans. Now, most Americans don't know this, but the Germans won the war, World War I, on the Eastern Front. And when they forced the Russians to sign a peace treaty, the peace treaty created what was called the Hetmanate of the Ukraine.
Hmm.
In other words, they carved the Ukraine out of Russia and set it up as a puppet state that was run by the Germans and Austro-Hungarians with German and Austrian troops on Ukrainian soil. And
Wow.
if you look at the boundaries of the Ukraine then and the boundaries of the Ukraine now, and go back to the Minsk Agreement, what you're reading is Brest-Litovsk version 2.0. That's what you're doing. So, in other words, this has been a plan and a part of European history since World War One.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a wow. That's a wow.
That's pretty amazing. And to me, seems like that might be in line with Nazi International.
Yes.
I would like to ask you a few questions about your book, The Third Way, Nazi
Uh-huh.
International, European Union, and Corporate Fascism. Uh,
Uh-huh.
it's a very interesting book. It talks about the inner workings of Nazi International. Can you tell us how the Nazi Party survived the World War II despite the fact that Germany lost the war, and how it became an international organization, and what role do they play today?
Well, it's very easy. Go back and look at the surrender. First off, there are two surrenders of Germany at the end of World War II. And at the first one, which was held on, I think, May 7th at Reims in France, Colonel General Jodl, Alfred Jodl, who is the chief of staff of the German General Staff, formally surrendered all German armed forces unconditionally to the Allies. The Soviets did not have a high enough ranking person to represent their signature on that surrender. So they had a second surrender in Berlin that was presided over by Marshal Zhukov. And there were three representatives of the three major service branches of the German military, the Army, the Navy, and the Luftwaffe, that signed the instrument of surrender in Berlin 2 days later. Now, notice something. In both of those surrenders, there is no representative of the Nazi Party signing a surrender on behalf of the Nazi Party.
Right.
And the Allies were in a position that they could easily have had someone make that signature because the British ostensibly had Rudolf Hess himself in custody after Hess's flight in 1941. And Hess, let's remember, folks, was the Stellvertreter, the placeholder for Adolf Hitler as the head of the Nazi Party. So when Hitler becomes Führer, Rudolf Hess becomes the head of the Nazi Party and therefore controls the entire apparatus of the party, including its intelligence services and including the bureaucracy, which he's in charge of putting people into positions of power in the government. So this is a powerful guy. And the British have him as a prisoner of war.
Yeah.
So why didn't they insist, Rudolph, go over there and, sign the instrument of surrender and surrender the Nazi Party and agree to the abolition of the Nazi Party? This is not done. So legally, if you look at it, you could make a case, a very simple case, that you have the surrender of the German military. There's no representative signing on behalf of the Nazi government, and there's no representative signing on behalf of the Nazi Party. Now, what happens at the end of World War II, as we know, is the Allies capture a lot of German scientists and technicians. What they're not telling you, and what I've gone into in my books, is that as the war began to turn against the Nazis after Stalingrad, Martin Bormann, who had replaced Rudolf Hess in the role as kind of the head of the Nazi Party, Martin Bormann called a meeting of German business and elaborated a strategic withdrawal plan. That's what it was, of shipping Nazi technology, technicians, patents, and money overseas.
Wow.
And he created over 750 front companies to do this. Now, you can read a lot of books that will tell you, well, the Allies recovered all of it, and that's nonsense because over $800 million ended up in the hands of Juan Perón in Argentina, and he was nothing but a puppet for that group of Nazis that settled in Argentina and Chile. So, in other words, what happened at the end of the war is the Nazis are very cleverly divvying up the technological spoils. Look what happens. We in the United States, and to a lesser extent Canada and Great Britain, get the creme de la creme of the Nazi scientists, engineers, and technicians. Okay, we get Werner von Braun, we get Arthur Rudolph, we get Hermann Oberth, and all these high-ranking Nazi scientists. All right, who do the Soviets get? Well, the Soviets got most of the middle echelon managers of all of these projects. In other words, they got hundreds of technicians, draftsmen that were familiar with the documents and could recreate them for the Soviet Union. So, in other words, the Nazis, I hope you're latching on to what the Nazis are doing. They are creating a nearly equal division of the spoils between
Yeah.
Russia and the Soviet Union. They're setting up a Cold War. And
Right.
the reason they're doing it is in their reasoning and what I talk about in the third way that you mentioned, and you can read it in one of their post-war documents called the Madrid Circular. What they're doing is they're using the tension between the Soviet Union and the United States after the war as maneuvering room for themselves. So they create what I'm arguing, Alex, is they create what is for all intents and purposes a post-war extraterritorial state In other words, you have a kind of a country, but it does not have any identifiable territory. It's kind of an underground international organization. And that I think is what you're dealing with these post-war Nazis or fascists. And you know, were they successful? Well, just look at our civilization now. It looks much more fascist than it looks American.
I
They're yeah, they you know, it's we've got a spy camera on every stoplight. So, you know, it to me, I think was a tremendously successful thing. And the really interesting part of the story is the best and most um, exotic technology they kept to themselves
yeah,
and were developing privately. I'm absolutely convinced of that. So yeah, it's something that is very unusual to maintain. The other part of the story, and I hope people latch onto this, that I talk about in The Third Way, was in 1942 at the height of the war, and as the Axis powers in Europe were at the height of their expansion and success. You know, by the summer of 1942, uh, the amount of European Russia under German control is just absolutely off the charts. I mean, you know, they rule Europe from Norway to the borders of Spain, the Balkan Peninsula, and they've got troops all the way down in the Caucasus in Russia, all the way over to the Volga and Stalingrad. I mean, it's just immense. And, you know, North Africa on top of it. Um, it's a titanically powerful military machine at that point. So at the height of all of this success in 1942, the Reichsbank, under the chairmanship of the German finance minister, a fellow by the name of Walter Funk, Funk, and IG Farben, you know, the infamous German chemicals cartel,
yeah,
sponsored a study on the post-European order that Nazi Germany wanted to impose. And what they were talking about in that study was imposing, listen to this, see if it sounds familiar. They were going to impose a customs union where there were no tariffs between the borders of the countries. There was going to be an open free market. The entire European economy was going to be integrated around the currency, which would be the Reichsmark. Now, if you know the history of the euro, you'll know that the euro comes out of the old snake system that preceded it, which was based on what? The Deutschmark.
yeah,
Okay. And running this whole thing, you're going to have a commission of bureaucrats that were there to make sure that the laws of the various countries involved were brought into sync with each other. So, in other words, you're going to create a bureaucratic oligarchy to run Europe around a central financial core based on the Reichsmark, homogenization of patent law, and so on. What's the modern European Union?
yeah.
It's almost an exact copy of that 1942 Nazi, underline, italicized, boldface that word, of that 1942 Nazi study. And what's the country in the center of it running the whole thing?
Germany.
Germany. You know, so are we surprised that any of this is going on now? No. Who is the chairman of the EU right now, the EU Commission? Why, it's Ursula von der Leyen. Okay. You know, so, or
Yeah.
as I like to call her, Medusa von der Leyen. But anyway, yeah, to me, it's amazing that people don't see this
So
because it's there.
they got what they wanted basically.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, so I want to get your thoughts on the AFD party. So we see a lot of people are saying that they are Nazis, but we just
No.
saw the suspicious deaths of six of their people running for government in Germany. And we also saw that the Germany wants to ban the party too. So I just want to get your thoughts on that party and those suspicious deaths
No,
that just happened.
the alternative for Deutschland is hardly Nazi because for the most part it's coming out of the old Eastern zone, out of old East Germany.
Yeah.
And you know that if you know anything about East Germany, it was hardly Nazi.
Right.
Um, the alternative for Deutschland, especially now under what's her name, Alice Weidel is the party leader. Um, if you look at what they are, they're kind of, I think, the German version of this sort of centrist right-wing populism that we've seen emerge in this country, that we're watching emerge, you know, all over Europe. France has a version of it with Marine Le Pen. Austria has a version of it. The Netherlands just elected Geert Wilders, who kind of represents the Dutch version of it. Uh, you're seeing this reaction against Mr. Globalone all over Europe if you're following European politics.
Yeah.
So that to me is what the alternative for Deutschland is. Um, you're far more likely, in fact, this is historically true in Germany, you're far more likely to find former Nazis lurking in the CDU, the Christian Democrats, after the war than in any other party. And again, I point this out in the third way when I talk about the Naumann coup. If you go back to the earliest period of post-war West Germany, you know, Chancellor Adenauer, if you look at some of the people in his cabinet and his close advisors, they're all former Nazis. You
Yeah.
know, Kurt Georg Kiesinger, who was one of his successors as the Chancellor of West Germany. Guess who he worked for? Well, he happened to be a deputy minister in Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry, you know. So
Mhm.
when I hear the CDU talking about the AfD being neo-Nazi, I'm just like, are you kidding me? You know, get
So
it.
they're just trying to do projection then.
Yeah, they're doing the projection routine, you know. It's no wonder they want to get rid of the AfD because that would mean the German people have a real voice in their government after, you know, after 70 or 80 years. So I'm not buying it. What they're trying to do to the AfD, and the only thing they're doing is they're making it grow more popular.
Yeah.
So, you know, eventually uh that whole Merz, Merkel, Schultz, CDU, SDU coalition thing that they've been trying to play for the last few election cycles, that's going to collapse. And it's collapsing as we're talking. You know, it's like we're watching the slow death of the CDU in Germany. That's just like we're watching the slow death of the Democrats over here. It's unreal to me.
Yeah, definitely. So we see basically you said the German government and the European Union is Nazi international. So
Well, I think it has I wouldn't say it is Nazi international. I would say that there certainly has been a an ideological and conceptual influence on the structure of the current European Union, as if you compare what it is to that 1942 study that was done inside of Nazi Germany. I think there are definite parallels that are there for all to see. I would caution against saying that it is just the Nazi International running Europe. Aspects of it do appear that way to me, and aspects of it don't.
yeah,
You know, I think der Hochklaus von Bloschwab, as I like to call him, the guy that used to run the World Economic Forum. I think clearly there you have a case of definite potential neo-Nazi influence. His father was a German general during the war. Schwab himself went to work for the Dessau company. You know, a lot of the German companies that were involved in wartime nuclear weapons research. So, you know, to me, that's a clear indicator that there's something going on there. But on the other hand, I don't think you could say that uh, the entire structure is neo-Nazi. It's much more it's much more overrun with globalist internationalists than outright fascists of that ilk.
Yeah, so we saw a lot of Nazis basically move to Argentina, right?
All over Latin America, actually, but a lot of them concentrating in Argentina, yes, and right across the border in southern Chile, around the old Colonia Dignidad, if you're familiar with that institution in Chile, which definitely had clear neo-Nazi associations. There were several that ended up. Friedrich von Schwendt, the guy that ran the Nazi counterfeiting operation, counterfeiting British pounds during the war, he ended up in Peru. So, and many of the people that ended up in Argentina actually uh, started some contacts during the 1970s with the drug cartels. So you've got another connection there to the drug trade, Operation Condor, that was held in Latin America with a bunch of Nazis and drug cartels basically running those death squads. So yeah, this it's a definite entity. It is there. It is a player on the global stage. Um, we think in terms of the big names that were captured by the Israelis after the war. If you look closely at the Eichmann thing, I almost tend to think that the surviving Nazi structure in Latin America fed him, to the Israelis. Here, have a small fish, go take care of this guy. We know that Dr. Mengele ended up in Brazil, and oh, just by the way, in case you haven't heard, all of a sudden in the last couple of years, there were these Brazilian tribes out in the wilderness in Brazil suddenly started having blonde-haired, blue-eyed children.
Wow.
Uh, so I tend to think that's a little indicator that there's something going on. A literal real-life Boys from Brazil scenario, if you've ever seen that movie. But yeah, they definitely were there. Um, the other part of the Nazi International that people forget about is Taiwan, believe it or not. The old anti-communist league that eventually was based in Taipei. That is, when you dig into it, that is a real front house for a whole nest of Nazi spies. And then you have in Vietnam, in the French period of the war in Vietnam, you had Nazi Waffen SS commandos training the French. So they literally put their fingers into almost every pie that you can think of after the war.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. So one thing that just happened was Bill Gates said that climate change will not lead to humanity's demise, according to the New York Times article. This seems to contradict his previous views on climate change. We know the UN and World Economic Forum have pushed this narrative. The Climate Action Plan from its 2030 agenda has been implemented in most counties and cities throughout the US, particularly in California, and of course throughout the world. What are your thoughts on this shift in the narrative, basically, of what Bill Gates said? Why do you think he made that statement?
Why did he do it?
Yeah,
Well, number one, it's typical Mr. Globalone hypocrisy. When one narrative is no longer succeeding, you have to come up with another one. Uh, you know, I'm never surprised by it, but there is a definite reason why there's a shift. A definite reason. Guess what it is?
money.
No. Well, that's part of it. That's always part of it. No, it's the artificial intelligence data centers.
Oh, right.
Why? Because, I'm going to quote my friend Catherine Fitz's observation. Because all of these projects that Mr. Globalone is engaged in are projects with a bigger carbon footprint than a Panzer division. Okay. So
Mm.
we're watching them create these artificial intelligence data centers that are already enormously power consuming ventures. So in other words, we can't claim to be all about saving the environment when we're building out artificial intelligence data centers that are driving everybody's power bills through the roof.
Right.
Okay. Number two, on the same scale is the fact that those data centers are not consuming just enormous amounts of power, but they're also consuming enormous amounts of water because they're water cooled.
Wow.
So, in other words, they're creating an environmental disaster, so they can hardly be claiming to be concerned about climate change when they're the ones really driving it. So, good for Bill Gates. He recognized that if he kept talking out of his hypocritical mouth, that would seal the fate. So he's back to promoting his quaxines and his, all the other nutty stuff like blotting out the sun and, you know,
Mm.
all of this horse pucky that he's promoting. I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised that they abandoned the narrative. And the other reason I think why he's abandoned it is it's just become untenable. There's too many people that are saying that the science was never established. The so-called science behind it is really bad. I mean, come on, blotting out the sun, you what could go wrong? You know?
Yeah, it's pretty crazy what he's trying to do. Uh, so getting back to Argentina, we just saw the United States government give $20 billion to Argentinian President Milei. I want to
Mhm.
get your thoughts on that geopolitical event.
Um, well, let me put it very simply, Alex. The last time I checked, the following places were not America: Argentina, Nigeria, Israel, and the Ukraine.
Yeah,
So I have a little difficulty wondering how we can claim to be America first when we're giving so much money that could go to support Americans to countries that created their own financial mess, like Argentina or Nigeria or Israel or the Ukraine. How are those America first? That's what I'd like to know. So, I feel I'm entitled to an answer, Mr. Trump, because I voted for you. So, give me an answer to that. How are we putting America first with all of this? Now, that said, I do have, let's be realistic for a moment. I do have some sympathy for Mr. Milei and his government because if you know the financial history of Argentina all the way back to the Peronis, Juan Perón and that whole crowd that followed him, Argentina came into the 20th century as one of the most, probably the most well-developed nation in South America. It had a sophisticated population, a sophisticated technology for the day. So it was well poised to be a powerhouse economically, technologically in that region. And they bought and sipped the socialist Kool-Aid. And as a result, the economy was ruined, the infrastructure never developed as it should have, and so on and so forth. Um, so Mr. Millet, I don't know if you remember his predecessor, for Cura de Fernandez, and she herself inherited a financial mess, and it was a mess of her country and the Western financial system's own making. So I do have some sympathy for Mr. Millet trying to sort out the mess. You'll recall one of the first things he did when he took power was he fired a bunch of people and just eliminated a bunch of government agencies and programs almost right off the bat.
yeah,
And when you look at some of the programs and agencies that he was eliminating, it was like a textbook of the American left and all the wacky, loony things. Let's have men play in women's sports and, all this nonsense. He eliminated all of that. So I have some sympathy for him. But does that mean we need to be bailing out other countries when we are going through a government closure right now.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm not buying it. You know,
Yeah, I definitely get your thoughts on that. When people go hungry in America, should we be giving money to a foreign country? So, speaking of South America, what are your thoughts about the U.S. conflict and war against Venezuela? The U.S.
oh,
government is saying they want to get rid of narco cartel headed by President Nicolas Maduro, but we know that China, Russia, and Iran are heavily vested in this oil-rich country with
yes.
lots of gold and silver and rare minerals. Iran's Hezbollah and Hamas have been in Venezuela for decades. At the same time, we know this is a communist regime who have been torturing dissidents for decades. But what do you think is the real reason behind this war?
Well, I I think the whole narco trafficking thing is an excuse for launching yet another nation building project war. I really do. Um, it's another let's make Venezuela safe for democracy sort of plea while we go in and try and capture all the assets. My problem with the way it's being approached is I lived through the Vietnam era, and I well remember all of the pretense that President Johnson used to get us involved into a massive escalation in that war, the Gulf of Tonkin. And there was one lone U.S. senator, a Democrat from Oregon by the name of Wayne Morris, Senator Wayne Morris. I remember him vividly. That would go on TV. He was kind of the Paul Wellstone of his generation. You know, if you're not familiar with Paul Wellstone was the Democrat senator from Minnesota that said that this whole mass weapons of mass destruction excuse for invading Iraq was exactly that. It was made up and an excuse. And he turned out to be right. Of course, he was suspiciously dead in a plane crash.
Yeah,
Um, Senator Morris was just adamant that the whole Gulf of Tonkin thing was a ruse and a false flag, which eventually it turned out to be. So we got ourselves into that war that the way it was fought, it looks to me like we had no intention to win. And have you noticed we haven't won a war since World War II? We just get into these endless wars and use them to create uh, profit for the military industrial complex and as asset seizure opportunities. And, that's it. So I'm looking at this Venezuela thing, Alex, and I'm thinking, I'm seeing the same thing.
yeah,
For one thing, my problem is and I may be barking up the wrong tree here. I don't know, but I'm looking at these boats that they're shooting up, and I'm thinking, okay, if I'm a Venezuelan mafiosi trafficking drugs into the United States, and I'm doing so by boat, am I going to put my millions of dollars worth of drug cargo on little boats that don't look to me like they have the fuel capacity for an ocean voyage across the Caribbean Sea,
yeah,
hundreds of miles up to Florida, where they can get shot up by anyone with a BB gun? Is There's something wrong with this narrative. And even if they have extra gas tanks, or whatever on the boats, I'm wondering, why are we not seeing any explosions and massive fireballs in that case of watching these boats being shot? I just wonder, are we really even dealing with people running drugs on boats? And for that matter, why have we not sunk any of their so-called drug running submarines? On and on I go. So I have a big problem here. And, if we're going to go into Latin American countries that we don't like because of their regime, well, front and center, let's take out Cuba because that's the center of all of this stuff,
Yeah,
and has been since Kennedy. So, there's just something wrong with this narrative. I don't get it. Um, our nation building efforts have not met with success anywhere where we have tried them.
I
Anywhere.
I definitely agree. So, how long do you think the U.S. economy is going to be able to withstand destabilizing pressures of war all over the globe, like funding the war with Ukraine, funding all this, funding all that?
Well, so long as the American dollar preserves its reserve currency status, then we don't need to worry about funding the war with Russia and the Ukraine, um, and so on. The real problem is how long can we sustain that reserve status when we are spending dollars hand over fist? That's the problem. And sooner or later, I'm old enough to remember when people started talking about the dollar's going to be abandoned within a matter of a few years when Nixon took us off of the Bretton Woods system. You know,
Yeah,
I've been hearing the dollar is going to collapse any day now. Well, I've been hearing that for a long time. But it is true that the more you dilute the value of your reserve currency, the fewer people want to hang on to it.
right.
And we're already seeing the cracks in that system with the emergence of the BRICS countries who refuse to trade in dollars in their international transactions with each other. So, China and Russia trade directly with each other and bypass the dollar completely as a clearing mechanism. The same thing with China and Iran. The same thing with India and Iran. So, they're ditching the dollar. Uh, the other big significant thing I think in terms of the dollar in relationship to your question is something I pointed out about 2 years ago when Japan and India concluded a mutual military logistics support treaty. Okay, now basically Japan and India agreed that they would support each other's military logistically if they ever got into a conflict. Not mentioning who this is directed at, but it's rather obvious.
Yeah,
And when they concluded that treaty, I remember saying to Catherine Fitz that you can bet your bottom dollar that they're not going to do any of the financial clearing if that eventuality ever arises. They're not going to do any financial clearing in American dollars. They're going to do it directly in yen and rupee. And she said, "Yeah, I agree." And I said, "That's huge. That's huge because what that implies is they're no longer willing to trust the stability of the dollar in an unstable situation like a major war."
yeah,
So I don't know how long it's going to last, Alex. I do not see that it can last forever if we keep, as you point out, rightly so, if we keep sponsoring all these idiotic wars that we have no intention of winning. Why would you want to be allied with this country, which says we'll protect you if you get into a war and we can't win a war?
yeah.
Come on,
It's
common sense.
it's pretty crazy. Yeah, our alliance with the United States isn't very good. Uh,
No.
So, in your book, you examine the connection of high finance and corporate cartelism with
Mhm.
CERN's Large Hydrogen Collider project, which is
Yes.
called the Cosmology Cartel. Can you tell us what are the cosmological implications of this project? What is this collider capable of doing, and will be so detrimental to the world?
Well, my problem, I want people to understand something right off the bat here. What I think about the Large Hadron Collider and CERN in general is speculation. I want to emphasize that. It's not their own official story of what they're up to. What they tell you they're up to is expanding their knowledge of the standard model of the particle physics of quantum mechanics. You know, they claim to have discovered a few years back the evidence for the Higgs boson, you know, the small little subatomic particle that supposedly carries the mass in atomic structures or responsible for it. What I think the project is that's the front project, and it has several layers that are more or less hidden to the public. And the reason I think this, and I've been interviewed by someone who has worked at CERN,
Wow.
who got her PhD in particle physics, okay?
Yeah.
And when I outlined my hypothesis to her, she was, well, I think aghast and agog
Yeah.
because she had never thought of things in this way. I'm not claiming that that's any validation for my theory. I'm just claiming that if you lay this out for people who do have a knowledge of quantum mechanics in depth, they are usually stunned that someone is thinking in entirely different ways about what's going on. So I want to emphasize that I'm thinking about that project in a very different way. So let's go back to, and I know I'm taking a long time to answer your question, but I want
Oh, take
people
all the time you need.
well, I want people to actually read the book. I'm trying to summarize what's in the third way. But
Yeah.
um, when the collider was first turned on, you'll recall that there was a great deal of outcry within the physics community at that time, prior to it going online, that said, well, they could possibly create a miniature singularity. In other words, what is known in quantum physics as a quark gluon plasma, which effectively is kind of a little black hole. Okay, teeny tiny little black hole.
Yeah.
And black holes tend to gobble up everything around them over time. Okay, so if you can't get rid of them, in a couple billion years, the planet disappears into a black hole, never to be seen again.
Wow.
So yeah, there was some concern about this, and the response of CERN is interesting. The response of CERN was, well, quantum mechanics. I remember this vividly. One of the physicists at CERN says, well, quantum mechanics tells us that if I drop this pen, it's going to hit the table and stop falling. But quantum mechanics also tells us that there's about a 1 in a billion chance it will keep falling right through the table. Okay. So as far as he was concerned, that's worth the risk. Let's turn it on and see what happens. Um, when they did turn it on, finally, I was in 2001, if I remember correctly. They had to shut it down almost immediately, and we were told that the reason they had to shut it down was that the cooling of some of those gigantic magnets, that the cooling in one of the banks of magnets on the big part of the collider had failed, and the collider began to overheat, and they had to shut it down.
Yeah.
And in the course of overheating, the collider suffered some damage. Okay. Now, at the time, I thought no. And this was before I saw the picture. At the time, I thought no. When they turned it on, they suffered a an unprecedented or unforeseen torsion effect. You know what torsion is?
No.
Okay. Torsion is what happens when you twist something. So imagine you've emptied a can of soda,
Okay.
and you're grabbing the can of soda and you're twisting the can in opposite directions. Okay.
Oh,
That's torsion.
I see.
Okay. It's what happens when you twist things. So what do we have in the collider? Let's follow this out. The collider is actually 5 colliders, and they're all linked to each other in series. You have 3 linear accelerators. In other words, accelerators that are used to get a proton stream accelerating in a straight line. And with their injection into each accelerator, it gradually increases the speed, and then it reaches a proton synchrotron, which is a small circular particle accelerator which is the final step of the proton stream just before its injection into the big circular accelerator that is itself the actual Hadron Collider.
Yeah.
Now, the small accelerator, I'm going to use my plate here. It's a round object. This big round object is the big accelerator, and the small accelerator is the bottom of my glass that I'm going to put right on the ledge of the big plate. Okay? Hope you understand what's going on. The small accelerator is circulating protons off of the axis of rotation of the big accelerator. Okay? And that proton stream is then injected into the big accelerator, which splits the stream and rotates them counterclockwise to each other. And then at a certain point, smashes the protons into each other so that they can take pictures of what happens. Okay. This is how nutty it is. It's like saying, okay, we're going to race two mechanical clocks around a racetrack in opposite directions and crash them together and try to piece together the clock from the resulting debris and
Yeah.
shrapnel. Okay, that's what they're doing.
Wow.
So anyway, so you've got the small accelerator and the large one. And what that will do, Alex, in my seventh grade physics thinking, is it's going to create a precessional wobble, just
Wow.
like the Earth tilted off of its axis wobbles around.
Yeah.
So being canted off the center of the big accelerator, it's going to create a precessional wobble in the big accelerator, and that's going to create a torsion effect with those big magnetic fields that are used to create both of them. And because of the interferometry between those fields, you're going to get a torsion effect in the big accelerator, and something's going to snap if you're not expecting it.
Yeah.
So if you go online and look at the picture that they took after they had to turn off the accelerator after that first power up, you'll see that part of the accelerator is actually canted. It's like it was sliced in half at a certain point on that big circle, and half of the accelerator is displaced almost to the top of the bottom of the other part. So, in
Wow.
other words, the thing snapped in two.
That's crazy.
Okay. What that tells me, Alex, and again, I have no evidence for this. It's a chain of reasoning. What that tells me is they had a massive torsion effect hit that particle accelerator when they turned it on and powered it up that they were not ready for. Now, it's important to remember two things. Every electrical circuit, every single one, no matter if it's your toaster, your refrigerator, or the Hadron Collider, okay?
Yeah.
Every single electrical circuit is a higher dimensional, hyperdimensional device. And
Wow.
the reason why is that the mathematics necessary to describe electrical circuits is hyperdimensional
Hmm.
because electricity uses imaginary numbers. And if you look at the geometry of imaginary numbers, it's a fourth spatial dimension perpendicular to the other three. Now, it's hard for us to picture that, but our mathematics can model it. That's my point. So, in other words, every device from your computer that you're looking at right now to your refrigerator to the collider is, in some sense, in contact or touch with a higher dimensional reality that is beyond our 3D reality. That's step number one. So when they turn that thing on, they're getting a hyperdimensional effect. And the second part of this is torsion itself inhabits that same realm.
Yeah.
So, in other words, was I surprised when Cern eventually came out and admitted 10 years after they turned the thing on that what they were also looking for was evidence of higher dimensions? I was not at all surprised because that's what that machine is.
Wow.
And in my thinking, they already found the evidence for that when they turned the dang thing on.
So have they been talking to entities through that?
Now, I don't think they're talking to entities, but and by higher dimensions, please understand, I mean mathematically. I'm not using that language in any new age, modernist, what the sort of stuff you find in the alternative media. I'm not talking about that.
Okay.
However, one of the things that's important, and I've mentioned this to that physicist, one of the things that I think people have to realize is that the world's biggest user of the internet is Cern.
Wow.
And the reason why is they're sharing the results of their experiments with scientists all over the world.
Hmm.
The other thing to remember is that I think in setting up a system where the computers are programmed to pull any anomalous or intriguing data and bring it and present it to the attention of those scientists, I think that there is a second secret level beyond the one I just, actually a third one, beyond the torsion, higher dimensional physics aspects of the thing that they finally admitted to, is that I think they're running an experiment deliberately, secretly, on what I call macro observer effect. Okay. To explain that, we have to remember that the thing that starts quantum mechanics off is Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. The uncertainty principle says that you cannot measure the position of an electron and its momentum at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what that means, if you look at it philosophically, is that you determine the result of the experiment based on what you're looking for prior to performing the experiment. So if you're looking or performing an experiment that's going to deal with the position of the electron, then before you've even performed the experiment, you've thrown out all interest in its momentum. And you're therefore determining to a certain extent the result of the experiment
Yeah.
or the kind of result. Now, that observer effect is only evident at a very small scale, obviously a subatomic particle, and it's only then that the observer enters the equation. But when we look at all of quantum mechanics, therefore, that means that it's a system of statistical observations. So, can we scale the observer effect up to the large scale? And if so, how will that affect the macrocosm?
Hmm.
So, what would you do? You would start taking correlation data measurements of when we turn the collider on and we get those gigantic magnetic fields. And by the way, they are several times the strength of the magnetic field of the planet.
Wow, that's pretty.
Yeah, that should start people thinking. And by the way, it's all embedded in rock. That should get people thinking some other things too. The the observer effect, I think they are correlating when we turn this thing on. Is there any group aggregate statistical deviation of behavior of people or animals or weather systems or solar activity and so on? So in other words, I think there's a level of the experiment that I call correlational data, that they're looking for effects in the big system, in the macro system, okay, to
Hmm.
their collider being on. Once we get to that point, then we get to the possibility of, okay, what if we change the perception of a group of observers? What happens then? Can we actually do timeline engineering? That's a whopper.
Yeah, it is a whopper.
That's a whopper. And I think that is exactly what's behind the so-called Mandela effect. I think they've been doing that kind of experiment for a long, long time.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. And Thank you, Joseph, for providing your insight on all these topics. And I just want to show the book, The Third Way.
Yep, that's it.
I'm going to share my screen so everybody can see your books and your website, thegizadeathstar.com. So it looks like Richmond, that's your latest book. Are you currently working on writing any books right now?
Not right now. The last two, as you put up there, I guess I need to put the picture of the other one up there. The Rialto Enrichment and the Rialto Enrichment Reconstructed are the last two books, and they have a lot to do with what's going on with the current financial system. So those are interesting books.
Yeah, I definitely agree. How many books have you written?
When you total them all together, about 45.
Oh wow, that's awesome. It definitely shows your dedication in knowing all these topics. Uh, and can you tell people how they can become part of your website?
Well, all you need to do is just go on the website. There are two levels of subscription. You can subscribe to the public stuff, and then there's a members area where I have some material in the members area behind the paywall, and that's where I do my vid chats, where I talk one-on-one with groups of people that are members. We have a lot of fun in those vid chats because we talk about every like just like this, only we talk in even more depth, and we talk about literally everything under the sun that you that you can think of. So it's kind of a free for all of freewheeling discussion.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. I think everybody should definitely check out Dr. Farrell's books. The Third Way is a very good one, and get his new book, and also become a member of his website to get all this exclusive information. And I would just like to thank you, Joseph, for coming back on the show and providing all this insight to us.
Yep, thanks for having me back, Alex.
Okay, and thank you all to the audience. Please subscribe. Thanks again.